So here's my list of how fracking may cause risks. Number one is spills. Spills on the surface, and I'm not too familiar with it, but there was a blowout, including hydraulic fracking, that kind of blowout. But this could be just a spill from the back of the truck, you know, from a valve not closed. Especially a spill of an undiluted fluid. You know, the fracking material is composed of largely benign materials. It is largely benign. It's the trace chemicals that are toxic. Largely, these fluids are composed of some type of thickening agent and sand and water. Now, I should explain that just briefly. What the industry faces is this. They need to move the sand into the fracture. So the sand has to move into the fracture and prop it open once they pull the fracking fluid out. You can't move the sand unless it's sort of like Jell-O. You can't get the sand in there unless you have a thick fluid. But if you have a thick fluid, you can't get the gas back out. That makes up the complexity here, why there's so many chemicals often used in this, because they want a quick time change from a thick fluid to a thin fluid. Thick to send the sand in, thin to pull the fluids back out and leave the sand and let the gas come. So that's why a spill of undiluted fluid, of undiluted toxic material, is a high risk. Certainly the pits. And one thing, a large element of public health risks I did not include in my report to Congress in 2004 because largely I know no one was aware, I certainly wasn't aware, about the air emissions. One pivotal study with respect to air emissions I invite you to read is by I forget the name of the hospital, but it's the Grand Junction Hospital. I'll have to get the name of the hospital later. A health study done for Garfield County in West Slope, Colorado. And that study pointed to the health risks associated with the volatiles leaving the reserve pit, I call it, but it's a drilling pit, and just volatilizing and then having chronic exposure to nearby residents. And allegedly, by EPA's scope in its scientific advisory board says that this new study will include the air pathway. So I emphasize that, very important. Dr. Theo Colborn is now of the view that this is probably one of the essential pathways causing human health risk, because it would be ubiquitous. It would occur at every reserve pit. If the fluids are not in a tank and contained, they're evaporating. The fracking fluid went down, it came back, or some of it came back into the reserve pit, right next to the well. Leaking pits is going to create some type of risk for many decades. I don't know what the New York's regulation. Did New York require a holding tank?
Yes and no. Single pads, yes. Multiple pads, no.
Interesting split. Well, holding tank is much superior technology here, just because it's vastly less likely to leak. And in this cold freeze-thaw climate that you have here, these pit liners often have a great problem, especially if they're put in the winter. That is, the freeze-thaw, and it just prevents some of the gluing to hold it, a higher risk. You know, we can also get bad stuff back out of the ground that didn't go down. So the third point here is the mobilizing toxic in the formation itself. In the Barnett Shale in Texas, that's principally arsenic. So arsenic can be released back from the formation because these fluids act as a lixiviant. They're doing chemical reaction in the formation. So you can get back toxics back. Radon here. What we call naturally occurring radioactive materials. They actually may be present in the target formation and then released by the fracking fluid. So production fluids then, at the time of the frac job, will contain both frac fluids and formation toxics. And what happens to them? Well, they can be re-injected. I mean, some of the fluid that comes back can go to a tank and go on to the next frac job. That's the cheapest way. So the industry will do that. But that doesn't always happen. They can be treated and discharged, as is occurring in western Pennsylvania when you have some chlorides problem coming out of the sewage plant. or they can be applied to the land. Let me explain these last two terms, bad well and good well. And one of the examples of contaminated groundwater that you see in the film Gasland is on West Divide Creek, Garfield County. And it was definitive from my point of view, maybe certainly not from the industries, but there is certainly adequate record from Jeffrey Thine and the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission to demonstrate that came from a bad well that caused the release of methane and BTEX into the surface groundwater. So a bad well is one where the engineering went wrong somehow. They didn't have the proper cement job in the annulus, some other aspect of the well. A bigger risk, however, would be a properly constructed well, a good well, that causes methane and BTEX and other contaminants to move vertically in the subsurface. So it's a good well. It's mechanically sound, and it produces gas, but there's lack of geologic separation between the frac zone and the surface, or the near surface. And there's vertical migration. Likely, first thing that happens is the vertical migration of gas, because it's vastly more mobile than the fluids. This is not a studied arena. Hopefully EPA in its new study will consider this lack of geologic separation and how that risks. The answer to a question like that is almost well specific. It's certainly very narrow, geologically specific. What applies in one place won't apply in the other. This is a list you can create vastly better than me. I was speaking to some beginning groups in Colorado with respect to this, but, you know, show me the data, industry. You can't claim this is going on for 60 years and a million times and nothing happened. All you're saying is nobody caught us. Every time they say it's successful and they make that point, just say, well, that's because the government hasn't been looking. And let me make this point about the government needs to look. Citizens can do a great deal. They can do baseline monitoring. They can report. But the government, your state government or EPA, needs to have that chain of custody of the sample to go into court and make an enforcement action. Chain of custody, and have to prove the pathway. Certainly help ensure a FRAC Act passes. This is Diana DeGette and Hinchley's bill in Congress. I understand it's largely delayed until the end of EPA study. But on this trip is the first time I became aware that your own state legislature may consider a moratorium. Certainly. If that passes, you have the time. You have some time, especially if the 2-year version of the bill passes. You have the time to do that transparent, independent scientific look. Put pressure on the state to make sure that science is done by those without a financial conflict to this giant industry. Don't let them have a peer review conflict as the EPA did in 2004. That's hard to do, by the way. Those in the know tend to be in the industry, at least those who know the engineering. On the Clean Air Act, EPA has a rulemaking in progress right now to aggregate sources that need air permits. That's a necessary thing for the air emission pathway. It's not clear to me, even though they aggregate, however, that they would get the volatiles off the reserve pit. Because the law focuses on sort of, as the Clean Water Act does, it focuses on pipes. It focuses on measured sources rather than ambient sources. And you could get those kind of ambient sources off the landfill or the spill as well. We need groundwater monitoring, and we need it before. And we need groundwater monitoring with specifically designed groundwater monitoring wells as well. Often a drinking water well is not adequately cased or perforated to separate one zone from another. So it has to be a well-constructed monitoring well to get the best job done. You can monitor at your own expense, and it will be expensive. But you have some rich people in this state, so it's achievable. And I think there's a new field emerging on ambient air monitoring, particularly in particulates, done by citizens. And one thing that intrigues me, you see in the film Gasland the use of a LiDAR camera that sort of acts like an infrared. It exposes volatile organics coming off of, in that case, a tank, but it can be seen in a LiDAR camera coming off of a reserve pit too. I've been encouraging citizens to try to acquire them. And where you have access, I'm not going to be part of your civil disobedience class that's coming up. Where you have access on a county road or something, use those cameras. That's it. I just wanted to make that brief introduction to the problem. You have an enormous burden in front of you. An industry that has got its way, as I say in the film, they've made a practice of 100 years, in your case in Pennsylvania, 150 years. Those that they pollute, they buy, and they buy their silence. Sort of like the Faustian bargain you get with leasing. This bargain is like this: you've been polluted, we'll pay you more than your land's worth if you don't ever speak that we're paying you. And we'll never agree, the industry will never agree that we caused this problem. So it buys those that it pollutes. And this is one last thought. We can all see the mood of the nation has changed. The BP disaster in the Gulf has created a focus by the world on the weak and deceptive practices of this industry. I had no idea until I've read subsequent to the disaster that there was another kind of Halliburton loophole, if you will, that is related back to the Vice President Dick Cheney, with respect to blowout preventers in deep sea, the kind that Norway uses, a remote control blowout converter that can be acoustically triggered if there's lack of electrical connection down the well drill. That was blocked. That was prevented from being applied by the Mineral Management Service. So the world is focused on this disaster. And that is the window to influence Congress and change this practice and bring this industry back into the 21st century control. Good luck.